Well, we're joined now from Paris by Andrew Hussey, who's the Director of Post-Colonial Studies at the University of London in Paris and author of The French Intifada, which explores the relationship between France and its Arab population. We'll be speaking to him in a moment, but first, here in the studio, Harun Khan, Deputy Secretary-General from the Muslim Council of Britain. Harun Khan, let me just remind you of the Prime Minister's words there about the letter. He said it was reasonable, sensible and moderate, and that anyone opposing it really has a problem. Have you got a problem?
Well, I think the first thing to clear up is that when we commented initially this morning, or early last night, it was before we had seen the letter. So we were asked for a comment on Eric Pickle's comments at another event. So we've seen the letter now, and we have replied formally to Eric Pickles. In terms of the content, generally it's reasonable, but it does tie into what your interview was saying earlier from Finsbury Park Mosque, that it leaves the impression as though, you know, the community is somewhere to blame. So I can... But
it was a bit rash to comment before you'd seen the letter, wasn't it?
Sorry?
It was a bit rash to comment before you'd seen the letter.
Well, we responded into a specific comment in conjunction with the letter as well that came from the BBC at the time. So, you know, we made a comment specifically about, we knew there was a letter coming out. We only heard yesterday from the media, actually, that this letter is coming.
So you regret there was a bit of an overreaction?
I wouldn't say it was an overreaction. I think, you know, I've been saying this throughout the whole day. I've been on various channels and actually giving the same interview. And I think in terms of the content, we don't have an issue. I think, you know...
Right, so you accept that you've got a responsibility to root out the extremists?
Why? I mean, it's not a problem in the mosques. So, you know, this is what the letter is saying.
So you don't have that responsibility?
No, we don't. I mean, I think we have a police system, we have security services in place.
Not your problem, in other words?
It's their job. Obviously, if I'm, you know, a mosque goer and I see something out of place, just like any other crime, I will report it. But it's not my job to go down and hunt down people. You know, I've got a job to do, and every citizen has.
You don't believe there are extremists in the mosques?
Not in the mosques, no. There's no, I mean, from my knowledge and going to mosques and knowing many mosques up and down the country, that evidence isn't presented with this letter, that to say that there is a problem at this mosque and, you know, there are imams speaking...
How can you be so sure, though?
I'm fairly confident from my experience and from what I've seen, because I haven't been presented any evidence. So if there was evidence to say, we know, for example, in Finsbury Park, OK, 10 years ago, there was a specific case. We can accept that. We can't deny that. But since that time, no one has come forward and said, you know, there are speakers in this mosque or there are, you know, imams. That's not the case. Okay. So if that was the case, why would the Minister for Communities write to 1,000 imams? So
Sylvie Begal, who's the wife of the man alleged to have radicalised the Charlie Hebdo killers, is challenging police powers as part of the Terrorism Act. You, amongst other organisations, are funding that challenge. Why? We're
not funding the challenge. I think our position on that is very clear. She's challenging the law around Schedule 7, which has been utilised. So we're supporting her case in terms of Schedule 7 and the way it's been unfairly, disproportionately acted on the Muslim community. So that's the bit.
Are you happy to be closely associated with the wife of the man who radicalised?
Well, we've had no direct engagement with her. It's more about working with her lawyers in terms of the case that's been presented.
But you're working with her lawyers?
Sorry?
You're working with her lawyers?
No, we're working with the different authorities that are working in terms of supporting her case, specifically to do with Schedule 7 and the disproportionate effect it's having on communities.
Harun Khan, thank you very much for joining me. Let's go now to Andrew Hussey in Paris. Do you accept... Are Muslims in Paris feeling got at by their government in the way that Muslims here are?
I don't know whether they're feeling got at by the government, but there's two very clear things. The first thing that people need to know is the kind of Islam that's practiced in France and North Africa is mainly what's called Malikite Islam, and Islam is not one thing. And Maliki Islam is quite a gentle, tolerant form of Islam. It's full of superstitions, music, mysticism, and so on. And it's a long, long, long way from the kind of fanatical Puritanism that the Kaushi brothers locked onto as an ideology. It's entirely alien to North Africa, into France. So I think ordinary Muslims in France feel damaged, misunderstood, and like everybody else, they'll feel wounded by what happens. This is not something that happens simply to the non-Muslim population of France. It's something that's happened to the Muslim population of France as well.
And do the politicians in France know how to respond to these attacks and how to discuss these issues that landed politicians this side of the channel in so much hot water today?
To be honest, I've been very impressed by people on all ends of the political spectrum coming together. I went to the march on Sunday, And it was a reality that a kind of healing process had begun. But they're hamstrung on the right and left by the structural nature, a structural issue in French politics, which is this word laïcité. Now, it's difficult to translate this into English, but effectively it means a kind of aggressive secularism. And it was brought in at the end of the 19th century, really to police the power of the Catholic Church. Now, Muslims and Jews as well could feel that this is an assault on their religious identity. And this is something that liberté, égalité, fraternité, the indivisible republic, it's something that I think has got to be rethought and recast for 21st century realities.
But are politicians are groping towards an answer on how to root out the extremists? Or, you know, for example, you, I think, have written how the answer is to be found in tackling extremism in the prisons rather than the mosques.
Yeah, it was interesting that last week French television news turned its attention to the prisons for the very first time that I can remember. But you see, the origins of this conflict, to my mind, are both rooted deep in history, rooted deep in culture, so there's not going to be any ready-made answers. What happened during the Paris attacks has been happening in France for a long time. It's just taken different mutated forms. So I'm not a pessimist, I'm not apocalyptic about these things, but if it's taken a long time to get to this situation, it's going to be generational, it's going to be a long time before France reshapes itself, not around terrorist attacks, but around the reality of having these different populations in the country.
Andrew Hussey in Paris, Harun Khan here in the studio. Thank you very much for joining me. John.